I'll just be blunt. If the two that are most likely to get nominated are the best we can come up with out of 335 million people, we got a problem. But I think that Nikki Haley showed that she has a lot of potential. Chris Christie comes with a lot of baggage, but he's got a lot of experience, and his thought process is crystal clear. I like them both, and I hope that one of them gets the opportunity, but it's difficult as long as Trump has such a commanding lead.
Welcome to The Optimistic American. I'm Paul Johnson. You know, we exist here at The Optimistic American to try and help renew the American spirit. Now, we're testing out a new venue. It's a new venue that is going to work within our integrated system where we'll still have our long-form guests with one-on-one interviews, but we're also going to start trying to plug in these current event programming where we have 4 guests that come on at the same time. Today's guest has an economist, Elliot Pollack. Elliot Pollack is one of this nation's best economists. He has a wealth of information, and today we're going to really focus with him on this whole concept of the balanced budget, budget deficits, the effect that has on the economy, and whether or not it's a real crisis or whether or not it's just a problem that we have to work on long term. We have Dr. Emily Basha, and with her we're going to talk about partisanship and tribalism and how extremism comes into play. And then my partner in this episode is Governor Doug Ducey. Governor Ducey, I'm an independent. He was a Republican, but I think both of us believe that it's important that we find a way to get people to work together in our country, to make certain that we try to heal the divisions. Both of us have questions for our guests, and both of us have input. I think you'll enjoy it, but I am looking forward to your comments. Whether you like it or dislike it, whether the venue works for you, even if you disagree with our ideas, let us know. And we're also going to be naming this. We're going to be taking ideas from people who are watching the show on a name that they think would be befitting of what we do. Now, I know I'm probably going to be sorry for that last one, but I think you're going to enjoy the show anyway. Give it a watch. Well, first, I'd like to welcome all of you back to the show, and we're going to talk today about 2 big subjects. We're going to talk about the federal deficit and the effects that it has on the overall economy. We have economist Elliot Pollack here to talk with us about that issue. We also have Governor Ducey, who's had to deal with a lot of budgets, and also is running a new organization that's called Citizens for a Free Enterprise that I think has some concerns about the deficit as well. And then we're going to talk about politics afterwards. There we'll go back to Dr. Basha, and we'll have a conversation about what's going on in the political sphere today. But let me start with this. I want to start with a story about the federal deficit, because to me, this kind of helps put it in perspective, and then I'll turn it over to Elliot. A number of years ago, in Arizona, the presidential campaign was going on. It was a Democratic primary. Bill Clinton was running. He hadn't yet won the primary. And I was approached by a guy by the name of Paul Tsongas. Now, Paul Tsongas had a series of positions. He supported the reinvestment tax credit. He also supported elimination of business taxes. And last, he was a supporter of a balanced budget. They were pretty pro-business positions. When I met with him, I said, look, I can't see, these are great positions in Arizona, but I don't see how you're going to win this around the country. His comment to me was fascinating. He said, I had cancer. He said, I had to go through chemo. And he said, I don't know if you know much about chemo, but during the time that I was going through it, he said, every time you get a treatment, you have to sit there for hours and hours and just wait for the chemo to get into your system. He said, and I spent a lot of time thinking about the things that I had done and what we had done during my period of time in the U.S. Senate. He said, during that period of time, a lot of economists were coming to them saying, hey, if you guys don't do something about this budget, literally, your children may not inherit the same gifts that you inherited. And he says, and we always thought there would be more time. There'd be more time after we won the next presidency, or more time after we won the Senate, or more time after Democrats won the House. And he says, I began to realize there really was no more time. He said, I may not be able to win with this, but I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to talk about how important it is. Now, it's not lost on me. He lost that race. But he did have an effect on that issue because Bill Clinton was the last president with partially a Republican Congress that actually passed a balanced budget. Now, for me, it's also not lost on me that that balanced budget helped our deficit begin to reduce, or our debt begin to reduce as a portion of GDP. But big things happened since then. And every time a negative event happens in the economy, we end up adding more debt because that's part of how they try to fix the economy. So we had the dot-com crash, and then we had the 2008 recession that took place. Both cases, they added more expenditures onto the budget and tried to create releases so the private sector would do better. Then we ended up with COVID. All of those added to the deficits, but no one ever began to reverse the trend. Well, now we're in a position, before 2008, we were at about $7 trillion in our total budget deficit. Today, 15 years later, we're at almost $33 trillion. It's about $1.8 billion per year that we're adding, per day that we're adding to the federal debt. It's a large amount. Interest is now getting to the point that it's almost larger than any other expenditure. Now, here's my first question for Elliot. I don't know how worried to be about this. All right, I know the numbers. What I'm wondering is, should we just be worried, or is this the time to start buying canned goods, ammunition, and get orange jumpsuits, right? How far should we be worried about this, and how should we see this? So if you can help us think about not only how worried should we be, but maybe help put some explanation to what's happening.
Depends on your time horizon, okay? Basically, if your time horizon is the next couple of years, it's a concern, but it's not going to change your life. If your time horizon is 10, 20, 30 years, it's a real problem because this isn't something you can fix overnight. This takes years to fix. And the fix is painful to virtually everybody in the country. Let me start by saying that the amount of debt the U.S. now has is roughly, it's actually about $34 billion at the moment. It probably turned 34 sometime around 3 a.m. Last night. But it's not
34 trillion.
34 trillion, yeah. It's not the amount of the debt that's the problem. It's the interest you pay on the debt. If you're a homeowner, if you're going to buy a car, what's the first thing you ask? What's my monthly payment? Well, the payment that the U.S. now has is incredibly large. It now is roughly 135% of GDP. And by the way, in 2001, it was 42% of GDP. We were 101st out of 160 countries in the world in terms of how much the debt was relative to GDP. We're now 16th. And 14 of those 16 countries in front of us, you wouldn't even recognize their names, okay? So the problem is the interest on the debt. It's the payment you have to make on that huge amount of money we borrowed. The problem is that that the government basically has spent $5 trillion since COVID started, which is a huge amount of money. And instead of financing that money when they had a chance, when interest rates were very low, out 40 or 50 years so we could grow our way out of it, they financed most of it short and intermediate term, which means instead of paying 1 or 1.5% on that debt, we're going to start having to pay 4 or 5, 6% on that debt, depending on where you think interest rates are going. And that's going to squeeze out other spending. Right now, it's basically not a huge problem, but it will be a huge problem shortly. Literally by 2000 and, it depends on whose estimates you use, but essentially it's not that far until interest on the debt becomes larger than the defense budget. Okay, that's about 2050. Okay, think about that. More paying for what we previously borrowed, the interest on what we previously borrowed, didn't pay it down, no principal payoff, just the interest on the debt, larger than the defense budget. That starts to squeeze things out. And the two things it's going to squeeze out are Social Security and Medicare. It's going to squeeze out defense. It's going to squeeze out Medicaid. By the way, mandatory, and then the only part of the budget that is non-defense discretionary spending, that's only 16% of the budget. So you're forced to deal with the things that are going to really hurt. Now, in the countries in the world and over history that have dealt with this well, usually about 60% is a reduction in entitlements, and about 40% is an increase in taxes. The definition of rich in this country is going to come way down so the government can tax you. Obama used to say, well, you're wealthy. You know, he never did define what wealthy was. We're only going to tax the wealthy. Well, his definition of wealthy, it turns out, was about $450,000. That'll probably come down to $250,000. I want you to speak to somebody in New York City or in Los Angeles and tell them they're wealthy if their family makes $250,000. It's wealthy perhaps in Iowa, but not on the coast of the city. But the bottom line is we are on a spending binge. We have been on a spending binge since Trump, mainly because of COVID, but the spending binge has not stopped one iota since Trump left office. So the question becomes, if you want to deal with it, and you wait until it's a real problem, until our credit rating is reduced, until it gets very expensive to borrow money, until we have another disaster that we can't borrow our way out of or print money our way out of, then we have to stay on this path. But if you want to avoid that, you're going to have to come up with a solution soon, and that takes time. Because it takes time to implement. It'll take 10 to 15 years until you see any real change in the level of debt. My problem is that a government as divided as we have now only does something in a real crisis. And if you wait till there's a real crisis, that means we can't borrow, or we can't spend our way out of a great financial crisis, or we can't spend our way out of a COVID situation. And so I can't tell you it's a problem today or tomorrow, but it'll be a problem for anybody on this planet who's in their 50s or younger. I can guarantee you that.
Governor Ducey, here's my question that I would have to you. You spent a lot of time on dealing with deficit issues as governor, and you've also watched what's been happening with Congress over the past couple of years, for that matter. You've been studying this for a fairly long period of time. Give me your input on this, if you would.
Both parties are to blame here. Both parties spend way too much. I mean, the Democrats want to tax and spend. The Republicans want to borrow and spend. I do think this is a problem that can be addressed if the chief executive has the political will. Most governors have to address this. When I came into office in 2015, the state of Arizona had $1 billion deficit on an $8 billion budget. And we were able to balance that budget in the first year. Now, it is painful. You do have to make tough decisions, and you do take a political hit. But I figured if we're not going to do it in the first year, we would never get to it. The federal budget is magnified exponentially on what we're facing at the state level, but there's no real metrics or guardrails to slow this spending. There also doesn't seem to be much of a penalty to the party that does the spending. So one thing I would say, and I'd love to know Elliot and Emily's input on this, if we could just slow the growth of the deficit so that it was less than economic growth, that would be a directional trend that we could measure ourselves by and slow the debt. I always try to simplify this when I was out in public speaking and saying, this is what our income is as a state, and that was our state GDP, and this is what our debt is as a state, and the interest on the debt is like a mortgage. So as big as the U.S. debt and deficits have been, they've been a very reasonable mortgage up until rather recently. Now they're growing at an incredible rate. I can't figure out for the life of me why the Fed did not refinance the debt when we were at near zero interest rates just not that long ago, just what seemed like the day before yesterday. But now we're in a real pickle around this. I think some things that will give us some comfort, although I don't want us to feel too much comfort, because I do think someone's got to run for national office and address this issue. If you look at the United States in comparison to other countries, nobody really has their balance sheet in order right now. And we do have a dynamic and still growing economy. We may be in for a recession, but we've always been the engine of innovation and dynamism internationally. And I think we can count on that. And there's many things we can do to begin to grow out of this. And it's not as if the debt needs to be retired, but it would be nice to see it heading in the other direction. If we could slow the deficit, close that gap, begin to pay the debt off, and we get another opportunistic interest rate environment to take advantage of that and make the proper decisions on how we would finance that debt. I'm curious, Elliot, what you think of that.
I think you're absolutely right. I absolutely agree with what the governor said, that it's going to take, you've got to do it in small steps. I would not count on paying down the deficit. But right now, if you take a look at budgets that are proposed for the next decade, we're growing the debt at $2 trillion a year. And so if that's the case, instead of 34 trillion, 10 years from now, it would be 54 trillion. And that, again, we start squeezing out things that people want. The political decisions become more and more difficult, and everybody in this country will feel pain. It takes a long time. If you could get to the point where the deficit, I agree with the governor, was growing more slowly than the growth and the interest on the debt, you are at least starting to make a movement in the right direction, and you ultimately grow your way out of it. But unless that happens, it's going to be very difficult. And given the magnitude of the decisions in terms of basically affecting people's ability to spend because tax rates go way up and entitlements start to exclude people over a certain income level, or the government has to basically lower its investment and squeeze the private sector out of borrowing. There's no good answer. It's not a quick solution, but if you don't start today, it just gets awful.
Yeah, and I think that's important that we explain a little bit of the difference between the deficit and the debt, because there are a lot of people who will be watching this who won't understand it. Elliot, if you don't mind,
Sure.
Talk a little bit about what the differences between those are.
I don't know if most people understand a balance sheet or an income statement. The amount of debt is on your balance sheet. It's like how much, it's an asset, okay? You don't pay your bills with assets, you pay your bills with cash, okay? So you do a cash flow statement. What do you pay? You pay the cash, the interest on the debt. That's the most important thing, because that's cash the government has to lay out literally every day to cover its deficit. Like I said, if you go buy a car, your first question is not going to be how much does it cost, it's going to be what's the monthly payment. The governor was absolutely correct. The same thing is true with housing, especially in this environment. People want to know what it's going to cost them because their assets and liabilities have to match. Imagine if you were spending 23% more than your income, you'd be gone pretty quickly. Well, that's the situation the U.S. is in. It's being a borrower of bad character, if you will, because it's not spending. It's not living with its income. And I'm not saying it has to live with its income, but it has to not borrow as much. So again, the problem isn't the total amount of debt. The problem is how much you have to pay every year to cover that debt. And that's the interest on the debt, and as the governor stated, we had the present administration had every opportunity in the world, as did the Trump administration, to finance this over 50 or 100 years at 150, maybe 200 basis points. We would have grown our way out of it. That chance is now gone. So now it's tougher decisions.
Yeah, and so the debt is the amount of money that you accumulate every year from your deficit spending. Your deficit is actually the negative that you have, and we're running at about a $2 trillion a year negative today. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, and so here's where it gets interesting to me is if you're going to make cuts, one of the things that's fairly clear to me in looking at the budget, if you take Social Security, Medicare, and defense spending, and then add to that the interest payment, the amount that we're paying every year on interest. If you say that you're not going to have any effect on any four of those, you really end up with only about 30% of the budget. That makes up 70%. You only end up with 30% that you can affect. And that 30%, while it can be dismissive, it's education, transportation, roads, military pensions are included in that other 30%. Military health care is included in that other. So if you take those off the table, you end up creating a situation where you have to be draconian on the other side. Almost 70% of those budgets have to come out. But yet both of you said something here that was important. One way to solve this is with a balanced budget. But a balanced budget means you will balance the budget every year and you will have no deficit. Now, that may only deal with your projections, not with the actual amount that you spend. That's in itself an interesting situation. But you can also create the ability to reduce your spending with the amount of deficit that we have on an annual basis, hoping that you'll grow into it. Either one of those two options start to work. And that's where Simpson-Bowles and other proposals have come into play. Governor?
So yes, that is something that can be done. Congress could put that kind of a commission together, but they'd have to put some teeth behind it. They'd have to vote beforehand that they were going to accept whatever the recommendations are, and it would be politically perilous for anyone that is on that commission because there's no easy or painless way to do this. And I've got some thoughts around this in terms of just the size of our federal government. I'll give you an example, and I do think state governments are instructive when you look at them. And the real difference between a state government and the federal government would be one, states cannot print money. And there's very little appetite to borrow money. You can borrow money, but not like they do at the federal level. But the other parts of the government are fairly similar in terms of how they look. You have agencies, which would be similar to cabinet posts. And if you looked at the federal government in terms of the head count and the ability to reduce the head count, the number of people working inside the federal government, there's a huge opportunity there. And if you look at that budget and then you look at the buildings and the real estate of the federal government, there's that opportunity to shrink that deficit and reduce it and to begin to reduce that debt. So when we talk about the balanced budget amendment, in theory, I love this idea. In practice, I think we need to be careful because if you put the wrong people on this commission, the way they would fix the deficit is by dramatically raising taxes. And I think that's a bad idea. I think that would drain the dynamism and the entrepreneurial spirit out of our economy. So at the state level, we were actually able to reduce the number of employees in Arizona state government and grow the number of private sector jobs by hundreds of thousands of new jobs. And all we had to do was fire one person. I had to fire one person my first month in office, a guy that threatened to shut down Uber and Lyft. Agency had a Department of Weights and Measures. Then I had everybody's attention. Then I put on a hiring freeze and said, you cannot hire any more employees. 24% of the state workforce was eligible for retirement in the next 4 years. As people retired, we would not rehire unless they were in the Department of Public Safety or in Child Protective Services. Everybody else just bought some new computers. We reduced the bureaucracy and the administrative state. And there are fewer employees in Arizona state government today than there were in 2014. So there are steps that can be done without pulling the rug out from underneath people. And I think also, Paul, if you look at the actuarial tables around something like Social Security, you can change it for people that are yet to be born. I mean, do you think people are going to be retiring at age 65, 50 years from now? And you affect a lot of how that operates as well. I think we should do it. We can go to people in their 30s and not disrupt their life at all. But we shouldn't pull the rug out from underneath anyone that's planning on Social Security, planning on Medicaid or Medicare. We want to protect those things, but we can reform and improve those things so they're strengthened, so they don't go bankrupt. But you need someone who wants to stand in front of the American people and actually show that we're strengthening the social safety net so that we don't lose it and that it doesn't go away.
All right. So, Elliot, I'm going to go back to you on this question. What the governor is talking about, I love the bipartisan commission on the deficit. One of the things that they've proposed is that you start with looking at this as a product of GDP. So their number, they say that today we're at about 130% of GDP. We ought to set our target at about 60% of GDP, that is a better long-term number, and it meets what the 50-year average is. They then say, now their view was that we should have some stabilization in Social Security, which may mean raising the age to 70 years old, 10 years out. Again, you don't have to do it short term. You can make it a long-term solution. They then want expenditures to not exceed 21% of GDP and revenues not to exceed 23%. Now, that may mean that you would have cuts in expenditures, definitely, but you wouldn't have to be draconian about it. And number two, you may have some increases in revenue, but you wouldn't have to be draconian about it. Is that along the lines of what you're thinking is the right solution, or do you look at this in a different way?
No, you're going to have to. I agree with you, and I agree with that commission, except for one thing I'll talk about in a second, and that is that Social Security and Medicare, 34% of the budget, that has to be dealt with. Now, just so you know, when Social Security went into, in 1933 or so, when it was enacted, the average life expectancy of American workers was 63 years. So for those people, you weren't getting money till you were 65. Hey, that was a hell of a deal for the government. Today, the average life expectancy is in the late 70s. For women, probably in the early 80s. And so not to have raised the retirement age more than 1 year when life expectancy increased so much is a major issue. And there also is going to be talk about whether people, it'll be means tested. So even if you paid in, what you paid in just becomes another tax, you won't get it back. The same thing is true with Medicare expenditures. I think you'll see those things, the pain will be targeted. But the places in the world where it has worked, more than 60% of the reduction has been in social spending, and less than 40% of the increased revenues has come from increases in taxes. Otherwise, as the governor talked about, you basically take the lifeblood away from the economy. Keep in mind that the incentives of the private sector, why it works so much, is there's a profit motive. They basically do what's going to make money. If they make money, they're going to hire more employees. And by the way, nobody holds a gun to their head and says you must buy my product. It's consumers every day voting with their money in terms of what they like. If you have too much government, which is related to politics rather than profits, what you get is an economy that is incredibly inefficient, and productivity will decline, and you will have a lower standard of living. And that's what you have to avoid. You have to come up with a mix where the standard of living is not threatened.
All right. So I'm going to throw some oddball ones on the table, and I'd love to have your input on this. Let me start with this one. One of the challenges that we're having today with Social Security and Medicare is that you have increasingly less people paying in and more people taking the benefit, meaning we have an aging population. Now, the governor pointed out something that I think we should always keep in mind. China's aging a lot faster than us. The rest of the world is aging a lot faster than us. So we're still in a good position in that. But nonetheless, there are more people who are aging and less people who are paying in. So my question that I have for you is, there are ways to resolve that. And I'll give you one, but love to have your input on this. Immigration. Right? Meaning, now maybe it's merit-based. Maybe we go out and instead of trying to stop people from coming in, we start recruiting. But we recruit the best around the world. We recruit people that are going to be in the workplace for a long time, people who are going to be very productive. If you bring in more workers and more people who produce, that's going to begin to resolve a portion of that problem. It's no panacea, but I'd love your guys' thoughts on that if you're interested.
My thought is that a sane immigration policy based on merit, based on the jobs that America needs, because we're going to be labor short, really, as far as the eye can see. We're going to be short on labor, and we're going to need some. But the immigration has to be based on the jobs we need. That will go a long way to keeping the economy vibrant. It'll otherwise we're going to suffer what virtually every country in the world, with the exception of the U.S., Mexico, France, and essentially New Zealand, are going to suffer, and that is they won't be able to support their elderly population. That's especially true for China and for Russia, that 20 years from now are going to be completely different places because of the demographics. So a sane immigration policy works at so many levels that I can't begin to tell you. Whether you can get a non-political, sane, need-driven policy is another issue.
So here's the second question that I would ask. So revenue. We're imposing tariffs today on our competitors. We're imposing tariffs on China, other people who are trying to sell product into the United States. Tariffs really just a tax. It's a tax on the consumer. What about things like a carbon tax? If you had a carbon tax, it would create a disincentive for Chinese products, as an example, and an incentive for American products. Now, obviously, the devil's in the details. This could be done up 1,000 ways, just like immigration. But I'd love to have your thoughts on how you would see a carbon tax.
I see that as a positive. I'm not sure how it would be structured. I don't, at this point, trust the government's numbers as to what that would generate and how it would generate it. I think the best way to do it is lower income taxes and have a consumption tax.
All right, so I want to shift a little bit. I'm going to pivot for a moment. And what I want to pivot to is the whole idea of partisan politics. Now, at the partisan level, we watch people in Congress on a daily basis that are fighting about any given issues, and oftentimes our focus ends up being on the people who are the most extreme. And I think that happens on purpose, right? The CNN loves to put up AOC, loves to put up green, and Fox loves to put up AOC. We're only seeing the two extremes on either side. But I do think that it's important to think about moving aside from Congress, to think about this idea of tribalism and extremism. Dr. Basha, I appreciate you being here with us today. If you would, could you give us an understanding of the difference between tribalism and extremism?
Yes, thank you so much for having me on, Paul. Yes, now I like to think of it as people being on a continuum. And if you think of tribalism, that is an important part of our everyday identity. We can be tribalistic in terms of our religious or spiritual beliefs and faiths, in terms of our political parties that we believe. could be part of community membership. Tribalism is a daily part of our life. Now, when it becomes extremist, now that's the danger and the pitfall that I see in the forensic psychological work that I do, the criminal justice system, is people who tend to see themselves as either a victim, they're driven by this radical ideology, and they see the outgroup as their oppressor. And once you have that kind of narrative, you really try and oversimplify and place people into these categories. And what it does is it lends itself to the justification of dehumanizing the outgroup, allowing you to condone any kind of violence, massacres or atrocities, because you just don't see this shared human quality. There's this lack of empathy for these outgroup members. The other psychological process that happens is you see outgroup members as homogenous. They're all the same, but you tend to see your own group as quite different and diverse. So there's all kinds of these psychological problems that are happening. I think it's important to mention extremists are not the majority. But because we see a lot of propaganda and misinformation through social media, or things that are really sensationalized or provocative, there's so much imagery and photographs and videos that are just so accessible today. And that sits with us. And we can't just forget some images or videos and these extreme forms of content. So that becomes so memorable. So we actually think that extremism is more common than it really is. Now, there are psychopaths. These are, probably less than 1% of the population are our current estimates of that. So these are people who really are willing to condone horrific, violent offenses and really feel no empathy or remorse. It's a complete disregard for society. Extremists really have a motivation behind it. And so I think that's important to see, like, what are some of those underpinnings? And that's where it connects you back to that radical form of ideology. So on the other hand, tribal members they're kind of more centrist. They're maybe more reasonable. You can have a logical conversation. You can point out facts or distorted cognitions that tribal members may be having, and they're more willing to negotiate and reconcile some of these differences. Now, you can turn a tribal member into an extremist, and the way to do that is through cognitive dissonance. And we're seeing that evidence today, when cognitive dissonance is really the disconnect between our morals and our ethics and our values and beliefs versus what we do or what our group does. And so now we're in a conflict. Do I protect my religious group, my cultural group, my racial group, my political group, even though what they're doing goes against my personal values or morals? Or do I just want to wash them away of having any kind of legal or ethical moral consequences for their behavior, because I want to absolve them from guilt, and I'm going to now point my finger at the other outgroup and say, well, it's their fault that we're doing these bad things or harmful things. And there's so much evidence, I think, that we can kind of go ad nauseum finding when that's happening. The really important thing is seeing, how are you participating in this? How are you playing a part in a role and allowing yourself to be self-deceived?
Okay, so let me ask one more question on this to follow up. First, when we're thinking about trying to cure this, how do we cure the extremists versus the tribalists, the tribal member? What's the difference in the way in which we approach them?
Yeah, I do. I meet with a lot of extremists in jail right now, even in prison, and doing all kinds of forensic evaluations. The bad news is the extremists really can't be entirely cured. With an extremist, you really have to move them away from the ideology, because it just doesn't disappear. It still is there, and you can't really bring
up. It's a worldview.
it's a worldview. It's so ingrained, and it's immune to facts. It's immune to having logical, rational conversations and presenting an outweighing of evidence, which is part of scientific inquiry. And so it's just not logical. So you can't really argue it away. But what you can do is shift their focus to hobbies, interests, other things that are pro-social, things that can enhance empathy and compassion. Those are going to be some of the things that you can really do with the extremists.
Governor Ducey, certainly what we see is this whole idea of extremism and tribalism has become a big issue. I watched you as governor. You did a really good job of not only listening to other people, but I always felt like you were thinking about other people. Oftentimes when you would vote on things, I would listen to your comments. I felt like you were speaking to more than just Republicans. You were speaking to a broader audience. But I'd like to know how you dealt with this issue.
Well, I did have a mindset, Paul, that I wanted to be governor of all the people. I certainly knew when I made a decision or went in a direction, very rarely are 100% of the folks with you. I mean, you look at the election and, at any one time, 40 or nearly 50% of the people can disagree. So I always wanted to put out my rationale. I wanted to take into account what other people thought. I really think the best leaders are in the persuasion business, and they should attempt to bring people along. I think Arizona is a great focus group for this as well, because we're about a third R, a third D, and a third independent or unaffiliated. So if you can bring those independents along with you, you can build a broad majority, and you can win over some Democrats as well. On the extremism, you're always going to have some people that are against you, knee-jerk, no matter what. Tribalism is natural to human nature. I'd like to think we have less of it in this country, where we can all be known as Americans, but I do think it's part of human nature. And what I always want to do is I want to hear the other side. I want to respect your viewpoint and then make my case. And the great thing about being governor is you're in a unique position to steer the state in the direction that you would like it to go to the best of your ability. But I was never going to show a lack of respect or civility towards others, including my opponents.
Now, the tribal member, when a tribal member is facing, when cognitive dissonance becomes an issue for a tribal member and they're being pressured to become more extreme, knowing that they don't quite fit into that category, they don't have the same psychopathy or dark triad worth of traits, what's the way in which somebody who's tribal can begin to find their way back to reasonableness?
I always say look for the exceptions. It can be so hard, but if you're creating some really simplified rules in your mind and trying to fit things or people into categories as moral or immoral or good or bad, or you're probably in a trap right there. But if you look for exceptions within your own group of people who are good and have done good things, there are people who are bad and are doing bad things, you're going to see that same heterogeneity within your own group as you're going to see in the out group. That is called humanity. And so I would say look for the exceptions and do that critical, deep processing and that critical analysis. When you're distressed and you're paranoid and I'm talking to people today in the clinical work that I do, and they're distressed. They're also very depressed about what's happening in the world today and nationally. People are not feeling very hopeful. And so I think the important thing is be aware when you're having those kinds of feelings that it will distort your perception, and it can feed and fuel all kinds of cognitive distortions. So be accountable for yourself. That's the best place to start. Be responsible. See how you can modify and change the views within your own groups in pointing out some of these discrepancies, or people within your own group that if you're catching them making some of these out-group biases. The biggest thing that I see also politically and even just culturally is centrists or tribal members have to move to where the extremists are, because the extremists aren't going to bend and flex and adapt to be more centrist. So I think that's what we're also seeing even in, you're talking about political parties, but it happens in all kinds of groups, not just politics, that people who are tribal become extremists. And so I think we just have to be very aware.
All right. So I want to hit on this point, and then I'm going to ask Elliot a question on it. By the way, thank you. I think that was a good description. But I want to apply that to something like anti-Semitism. One of the things I find very interesting is that when you listen to people, there's this sense that it's the other group that's being anti-Semitic, right? So Democrats will look at Republicans and they look at what happened in Charlottesville and they see the people marching down the road with torches saying, Jews will not replace us, right? Well, that's definitely, that's an extremist. On the other hand, we're having people today, the Harvard professor who came out with that comment saying that what Hamas did was justified the day that they killed 1,400 people. It's just shocking. Of course, Republicans like to focus on that. Both those two groups are extremists. Both of them are. But what we do in politics is we defend our group. So if you're a Democrat, you're going to defend those students at Harvard either by saying, well, it wasn't as big a deal as they said that it was. The answer was, no, that was a really big deal. That's a really big deal what they did. Or you're going to say, my group, look at your group. Look at how extreme your people are. And you point back at them. The challenge is that if we want to fix it, I think what you're saying is you have to start by looking internal, and you're going to have no effect on telling the other party what they're doing wrong. But you actually might have some effect on your own group by saying what you're doing is wrong. That's not the way to approach it. Elliot, I know you and I over the years have talked a lot about the subject. I'd love your input.
Well, for a lot of reasons, including some the doctor mentioned, but for 20,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, you approached somebody outside your tribe, you knew you were in danger, and that is buried somewhere in the human brain. And so we are basically nervous when we approach people from a different culture, a different color, a different whatever it is. That's humanity, and it's a question of getting over it. But we've basically devolved into a society where it's us versus them. It's not, let's sit down and talk about it, let's understand each other. Life is a battle between good people and bad people, and that is utter nonsense, just utter nonsense. And what's scary to me is that there is a percentage of the American population that is buying that argument. It is cognitive distortion. It is something is viscerally is bothering them, and they again we have become an us versus them society. We don't feel safe because we don't know the other group, and if we don't feel safe, there must be something wrong with them. All these thought processes are essentially, they've been put on their head. They make no sense anymore. The logic is gone, and what was America is, in my opinion, for a lot of people is gone, because the great thing about America is you could say whatever you wanted, you could disagree with somebody, and generally college was about talking to people you didn't agree with so you could figure them out and try to figure out whether their reasoning was better than yours, and if not, you felt better about yourself, or at least you accepted what they were saying. That seems to have been lost, and it seems to have been lost especially on the college campus, which is, to me, just horrible.
Elliot, have you read the book, The Coddling of the American Mind?
I have.
Yeah. I mean, it hits on a lot of those points. For me, there's a common narrative that's important for people who are in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party that are not part of the extremes on either side. if there's not a central narrative that pulls them together, we have a problem. Now, the central narrative, to me, seems to be, it should be wrapped around the same concept as to what we put together 250 years ago, which is the idea of the individual. All right, you can be conservative or you can be liberal, but our society has always bought into this notion that the individual is at the center. And in fact, we gave the individual a certain set of rights that are actually superior to the rights of government and a court system to ensure that that's enforced. Now, people forget what those rights are sometimes. Certainly civil rights, equal rights, and human rights are in that, but so's property rights. Property rights are all a part of how do you protect the individual over government being extractive and taking things away from the individual. And again, within that playing field, you can be liberal or conservative. But what happens with the two extremes is they don't really believe that the individual should be at the center. They identify us by our group on both the left and the right. I mean, that's why we hear the idea of, white replacement theory or white genocide on the far right, and then we hear the words white privilege on the far left, because they're identifying people based upon their group. They're saying that our group meets this criteria, and we're going to judge all of you by the group that you're in as well, which is an anathema to what Martin Luther King said when he said, hey, we should be judged by the content of our character, not by the color of our skin. That debate on college campuses has now become so strong. If you even say what I just said, we got delisted on a show that I did on YouTube because we had a conversation about that very topic. And the answer was there were some people who felt unsafe, didn't like it. They were upset. And YouTube, demonetized us based upon that concept. Here's the point. If we can't have a discussion, the individuals, it is key for the individual to survive that freedom of speech exists. But it's also important, Emily, I've heard you talk about this in the past, that from an individual standpoint, it's important that free speech exists, that they gain a benefit as well. I'd love your input on that.
Yeah, if you're not engaging in that challenge and that internal conflict that can bring up for you, and to find some kind of commonality or resolution, we're not growing as humans. We grow our struggle muscles through confrontation, through challenge, through inquiry, through debate. And if we can't have those conversations because of fear of offending somebody or being politically incorrect, then I think we're going backwards. We're not growing. And it is concerning. And Paul and I, we often talk about strength over safety. And I think this is part of the dangers of cancel culture within woke culture that they're promoting. Because now teachers, and I have students, doctoral level students I supervise, if teachers are having to bring down the level of what they're training and their teaching and their education because they're not allowed to challenge intellectual curiosity because of fear of offending somebody, you're teaching to the lowest common denominator of the person who is the most fragile in the room. And how is that promoting growth? I don't want to send my daughter to a university that promotes that. That is concerning for me. I want her to be challenged. I want her to feel like, oh, that's an interesting point. How am I going to defend it? Let me go and do my research on that and come back and continue the conversation. But if it's not even being modeled of how to have that kind of mutual respect, to have that discourse and that challenge, if that's not even modeled at the top levels of leadership in government, in university campuses, in administrations, how is that going to be modeled for college students?
And I think you just tied back into what Elliot started our whole discussion with, which is the budget, meaning it's not just college professors. We don't want to have a conversation at the congressional level about balancing the budget because it feels uncomfortable. Last night I was at dinner at my mom's, and I was talking about this subject and saying I was going to go on with the renowned Elliot Pollack to talk about budget deficits and that the governor would be there. And anyway, she said, well, how would you balance the budget? I said, well, one of the things that you'd have to do, you can't do this unless you have some effect on Social Security and Medicare. And her instant answer was, don't you even think about cutting that. In fact, you can't even talk about that. And I go, okay, Mom, maybe. I said, but let me ask you a question. If we decided that we were going to raise the age of everybody who's 50 years old today, we're going to raise the age of retirement to 70, would that bother you? She goes, oh, no, that wouldn't bother me. All right, well, okay, so that's a cut. All right, any way you look at that, that is a cut. But it's just like life insurance. The benefits have to match the premium. If it doesn't work, sooner or later, it's out of whack. But if you can't even discuss things, if you can't have a real conversation about it, which, by the way, I think that this is one of the reasons podcasts are so powerful. You know, people are watching these Republicans who came into the debate today, not just on the debates, which I thought the debate was a good debate, but if you have to watch them on Sean Hannity, you get the 5-minute clip that Sean Hannity wants to give you. If you watch them on a podcast, you can actually get a full hour and understand who they are. I think the ability to solve our public debt is going to come from longer conversations where people can actually put their point of view out and talk about these hard ideas. Elliot.
Well, I think that this is so basic and it's missing in so many places in our society at the moment. It's scary. The things that were talked about in the Coddling of the American Mind, which I thought was a book most people in today's world need to read, the untruth of fragility. What doesn't kill you will make you weaker. No, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. The untruth of emotional reasoning. If it bothers me, there must be something wrong with the other guy. I got to shut him up or I got to go hide. Instead of having the discussion that Emily talked about, the discussion that everybody in this country has had a zillion times in their lives. I also believe that the us versus them mentality is nonsense. It's crazy. It doesn't belong in America. And I thought we were getting rid of it. And over the last 20 years or so, it's come roaring back. And we could talk about the reasons, but read the book and you might get some idea. But the bottom line is that if you don't talk to people, understand what they're like, understand their reasoning, and then you can say, well, no, I disagree with you here, and this really bothers me, or, well, yeah, I see your point. You're nowhere. And what we have now in the country, especially at college campuses, is a bunch of college kids who have never learned the basic concept of reasoning and talking to people and find out what they really are. No, we got to keep this guy off campus because we don't like his point of view. Have you ever heard him? Have you ever talked to him? Have you ever asked him detailed questions so you can really attack him on points that you don't like? No, they haven't. And universities back that up, which is just insanity. So this to me is a huge problem, and I hope Emily has a way to figure it out to get us back on track. But right now, the basic concept of what America is being denigrated by our universities and colleges.
So, Governor, one of the big, I mean, obviously what Dr. Basha is talking about and what Elliot is talking about on our college campuses, this whole idea of cancel culture, the need to feel safe, seems to be taking a priority over the value of free speech. You know, as governor, you played a large role in our universities. We have some fine universities in Arizona, but I'd love to know your view of that and where you think it becomes a problem and how you think it is that we try to ensure that everyone does have a fair chance to have a say.
Well, this cancel culture is wrong. And I don't know where these safe spaces crept in. We're trying to prepare these young people for life. And that means you're going to leave the cocoon of college and go out into the workforce. So I don't think we're serving them well at all with whatever these safe spaces are. I don't think silence is violence, and I don't think that your views, that your words are violence. I think when you don't like somebody else's ideas and you want to stop that speech, what's necessary is more speech. And that's right from our founders and the philosophy that went into the Declaration, our Constitution, and much of the Federalist Papers. So I want to see more of that. I'd like to see more civility on our campuses. I am proud of what's happening in Arizona. I think Arizona State University and University of Arizona were among the top ranked colleges and universities by the FIRE Index for free speech on campus. I'm shocked at what I'm seeing at our elite institutions and the Ivy League on what's happening with this tragedy on October 7th, and Israel, and how some of our Jewish students are being treated. I also think people have demonstrated that they know very little, or they have been poorly educated if they are going to defend Hamas in this situation and tear down these posters of kidnapped Israelis and mock people whose families have been harmed. Peggy Noonan wrote a great article in last Saturday's Wall Street Journal when she said that this oppressor-oppressed matrix and prism, Western colonialism, and then all Western civilization has really crept in as the version of world history and American history. I think our students should know an informed American history, warts and all, and that's not what they're demonstrating. So they probably score very high in AP placement courses. They probably do tremendously well on the SAT, but they certainly don't know their American civics and history, nor what's going on in conflicts geopolitically around the globe.
Yeah, it's, the key is this. If you believe that the divisions in America are important, if you think that is a big problem and it needs to be worked on, which I think most people do, or at least most people who are, I'd say 80% of our public thinks, well, I've seen polling, it's about 80% of our public think that the divisions are highly problematic. If that's true, you cannot fix them without listening to people that you don't agree with.
Of course.
You just can't. The only way that you can fix this is by us all being willing to listen to people who have different ideas than we do. Dr. Basha?
I'm thinking about raising our 2-year-old daughter and all of this. And I think, oh my gosh, there's so many similarities and metaphors that come out of parenting and thinking about finding solutions. And one of the things in anti-fragility and raising confident, strong children is really accepting where they're at right now from a developmental model, and yet always expecting more from them. And that's what's going to promote growth and development. It's not about demoralizing, dehumanizing, invalidating, shouting, treating somebody as morally inferior to you, disrespecting them, attacking them on a personal level. I mean, none of those things are going to move us in the direction of growth. And if we think about being in a developmental process, unfortunately, sometimes things need to get worse before they get better. And I really do hope, and I am optimistic that it will get better because, things are just naturally going to rebound. But I think more people need to be having the kind of conversations that we're having.
There was I listened to a fellow who was African American and did a TED Talk about a year ago, I believe. In his TED Talk, he made the point that his concern was that we needed to begin to have policies that address people based upon an economic level instead of a race level. Now, you can agree with that or disagree with that. That's okay. I'm not trying to get you to take a side on it. But what was interesting was it created a huge problem for TED because there were people in the audience who said, that made me feel unsafe. I felt attacked by that. Now, I've listened to his TED Talk, and I encourage anyone on to listen to it. It's now become famous because Ted delayed it for a period of time before they were willing to put it up. But the point is, it also takes adults in the room saying, well, I understand that makes you feel uncomfortable, but everybody has a right to have a say. And that's the challenge, I think, in our universities. It's not as much the young people, it's the people who are the adults, the deans and the presidents and the people who are in charge, not saying, no, they have a right to have a say as well. I mean, I think of this Harvard debate. The challenge with the Harvard debate is that it's not so much that there were people speaking up that said brutal things about Israel. It's that in the past, when people on the other side spoke up, they closed them out. They said, no, we're not going to allow that to be on our campus. Well, that looks like then you're endorsing the radical comments being made on the left, right? It sticks you with it. Whereas if the university said, no, we have an open policy, and we're going to listen to people on all sides, even people that we disagree with, even people that we think are extremists. The idea then becomes they're not endorsing it. They're just endorsing the wonderful concept of free speech, that there's a reason why it was the First Amendment.
I couldn't agree more. If I don't understand how you possibly figure out somebody unless you sit down and talk to them, unless you have an exchange of ideas. What about this? What about that? Do you really believe this? Is this what I'm hearing from you? And at least it will narrow down the points of difference, and you might still hate the guy at the end of it, but at least you'll know. And you know what? If you hate them, so what? They're going to be people you hate in life. But your job is to go out and support your point of view, but you can only do that by understanding everybody else's point of view. And it's not, the world is not cut into good people and bad people. It's cut into people with different opinions, and you've got to have some cross-pollination from those. That's how you, as you put it, Emily, that's how you grow. You don't do that, you're basically still in third grade.
All right, last question, and that's the debate last night. Now, I loved the debate last night, but obviously the public doesn't because it's losing sponsorship. However, I want people to answer who they thought won, and I'm going to go ahead and give mine first so you guys can play off of it. I thought the two winners last night were Nikki Haley and Chris Christie. Chris Christie looked incredibly presidential, and Nikki Haley, she's a spark plug. I mean, she definitely is able to give back certainly more than she ends up taking. I also thought in the debate, one of the things that really ends up being missed, it is amazing how much good content is there, but we just dismiss it. We think because it's either political or because it doesn't have Trump in it or because we're a Democrat, whatever the reason is, that it's unimportant. And I disagree. I think it's a really important thing that we have in this country.
Well, I'm not sure who won the debate. I think Vivek lost the debate. I don't think you should bring people's children into this discussion. I think that should be out of bounds. I think Nikki handled herself well in that setting. Nikki and Chris know their stuff very well. And I see their worldview and my worldview match up. I think we should have a muscular foreign policy. I don't want to get into any unnecessary wars, but I think if you're going to be the leader of the free world, you have to lead. I also think they've got real experience in governing a state. Tim Scott is somebody of the highest character and incredibly likable, and I think can do great things for conservatism. Ron DeSantis is a very smart guy and was an excellent governor in the state of Florida. And Florida is really one of Arizona's top competitors, along with Texas and Tennessee, for economic development, net in-migration, all of the good stuff that's been happening in terms of a dynamic American economy has been happening in those states. So I watched the debates. I'd like to say I enjoy them. I wish that the former president was on the stage. And I'm concerned about where we are in this cycle. I think we'd be better off if we could really turn the page in both parties and have a fresh face. I also think we've been robbed, Paul, of any real debate or discussion around policy since 2016. So I do like some of the back and forth. You've got some smart people on that stage, and they're making their case to the American people. My concern right now, and this can change, it appears as if they're all playing for a distant second. Now, as we get closer to Iowa and New Hampshire and Super Tuesday and some of the other things come to life and people start tuning in or focusing, I still think things can change. But you and I watch these things because we've been part of this game, and I think we're very interested in it. So let's just stay focused on it and see what happens in the coming months. We've got Thanksgiving and Christmas, and before you know it, it's going to be Iowa and New Hampshire. So we'll see. I know there's a pressure now to cancel the debates and stop that. I hope that's not the case. We've got to let the people vote, let them caucus, and run the primary calendar.
Elliot, I'll give you, and then Emily will get the last word.
I think it's hugely important. It's difficult to get people looking at it when such a large percentage of the people who would normally look at it have already made up their mind one way or the other. And that is unfortunate. I'll just be blunt. If the two that are most likely to get nominated are the best we can come up with out of 335 million people, we got a problem. But I think that Nikki Haley showed that she has a lot of potential. Chris Christie comes with a lot of baggage, but he's got a lot of experience, and his thought process is crystal clear. I like them both, and I hope that one of them gets the opportunity, but it's difficult as long as Trump has such a commanding lead.
All right, Dr. Basha, who did you think won?
Well, I think just overall, I want to commend all the candidates because I think it wasn't just based on personal attacks. It was had like sound, critical responses. I personally really like Nikki Haley. I think she's astute. I think she's well versed in a lot of topics. I like her approach to the questions. I think she's a critical thinker, and I think she did a great job.
All right, everybody. I'd like to thank you for being on the show. We appreciate you taking part in it. Elliot, special thanks to you for the time that you've given us. Dr. Basha, to you as well. Governor, thank you. Thanks again.
Take care.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
If you like what we're doing, push that subscribe button. You won't get any emails from us, but it does help us know whether or not the programming that we're providing for you is something that you see as being of value. We also recommend that if you're interested, go to our website, become one of our members. Take a look at becoming a premium member if you'd like to get any of this content without commercials and the other perks that we give as well. In any event, we definitely appreciate you being here as part of the Optimistic American Show. Have a good night, good evening, and Godspeed. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned, and we can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.